This is the Read to Lead podcast, episode 533.
I tend to think that if we treated our office jobs, if we treated our workplace jobs more like the chess player preparing for the World Series tournament, or more like the Olympic sprinter who's getting guidance from their coach, we would see just an explosion in proficiency in many domains.
Whether you're a student studying for an exam, an employee facing a new skill at work, or someone who just wants to get better at anything of interest, you're in the right place. Today, you'll learn how anyone can improve their performance, develop new expertise, and experience personal and professional growth. I am Jeff. This is the Read to Lead podcast, the podcast that's dedicated to those two things, your personal and professional growth. I believe that if you want to achieve true success in your business and in your life, intentional and consistent reading is a must. Today, our guest is Scott H. Young. He's the author of Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. I'll be asking Scott to share about how what we learn from others impacts the complexity of the problems we can solve, imitation as the seed to original work, the role courage plays in mastery, and much more. If you like what you hear today, you'll want to join me next month along with other members of the Read to Lead community on July the 18th as we welcome Scott in for a private chat about many of these concepts. So we'll go even deeper than he and I are able to go in today's conversation. If you're not currently a Read to Lead Plus member and getting all the benefits that membership provides, you can sign up for a free trial right now and ensure that you're able to join us for next month's private session with Scott. The place to go is simply jeffbrown.me. That's my name, then .me, jeffbrown.me, and we'll see you next month for our private session with today's guest, Scott Young. One more time, jeffbrown.me. Scott H. Young is a writer, programmer, traveler, and avid reader. For the past 10 years, he's been experimenting with ways to improve his learning and thinking skills. And he shares his insights on his website, scotthyoung.com, where he explores how to accelerate learning, careers, productivity, and overall well-being. While he doesn't claim to have all the answers, he offers a starting point for anyone seeking self-improvement. At his website, you can connect with Scott and find his blog, articles, challenges, products, podcast, and a free newsletter. His new book is called Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. Well, Scott, welcome here. This is a topic that has been on my radar for a number of years. I left college as someone who thought learning was over. And then about, a decade later, realized that I wasn't quite done with the learning. And I left college with that being something that I did not enjoy. That has since changed. So I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. So welcome and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Well, on the topic of learning, I mentioned to you before we started officially that your first book, Ultra Learning, is one that I've been recommending to those in my private community, and particularly those who have gone through the Note-Making Mastery course. Talk a bit about your first book and sort of how that came to be and your general passion for learning and personal development.
Yeah, so I have a kind of a weird journey into this space because this all started in my early 20s. I did a number of these projects. I was kind of like early blogosphere when people were it was a little bit more unofficial and people were doing stuff. And so one of these projects I did was learning MIT's computer science curriculum. They post all their material online for free. And so I got the idea of has anyone ever tried to make a degree out of the stuff that they post online for free? And so I did that over a 12-month period of time. I called it the MIT Challenge. I did another project with a friend. We traveled to 4 countries and we're learning 4 different languages. We were learning Spanish in Spain, Portuguese in Brazil, Mandarin Chinese in China, and Korean in South Korea. And the kind of gimmick, I guess, if you could call it that, of the project was that when we would land in each country, we would try to the greatest extent possible to not speak in English. So when we were landing in Spain, we were just speaking in Spanish, and it had some comical consequences, but it also had the consequence that by the end of our stay in most of those countries, even if we weren't speaking perfectly, we were speaking fairly fluently. Like we were able to talk to people and interact and do the kinds of things you'd expect from day-to-day life. So we considered that project a success. And since then, I've done some other smaller projects, learning portrait drawing, quantum mechanics, various things. And that culminated in this book, Ultra Learning, which took not only my projects, but really a lot of the people from this weird Wild West early vlogosphere environment who had inspired me in this direction. So people like Benny Lewis, who speaks 10 plus languages, people like Eric Barone, who taught themselves every single facet of video game development. So the art, the music, the programming, the design, everything, and then ended up making this game that sold millions of copies. And now I don't know whether he's still working on anything. He can be comfortably retired if he wants to be. And, or people like Tristan de Montebello, someone who I actually was friends with before he did his project, who became the finalist for the World Championship of Public Speaking. And he had not really given a speech outside of college 7 months before he started. And he just got on this intense journey learning it. So Ultra Learning was about documenting these people who kind of with gusto take on these impressive and kind of somewhat aggressive learning projects and trying to use that as a backdrop for figuring out how does learning work? How do you learn more effectively? So even if maybe you're not trying to learn 4 languages in a year, maybe you can figure out some way of learning the things that you care about a little bit better.
Before we dive into this new book, Get Better at Anything,
I
want to talk about the dedication. Tell me about Thomas and Julia.
Yeah. So I have 2 children now, which I did not. So my book, Ultra Learning, came out in 2019, and my son was born January 2020, just 2 months before the pandemic. So I have 2 pandemic babies. Well, the last one was kind of outside the pandemic, but so it's been a busy time. I've been working on this book. I had 2 kids, so I think all these experiences shift me in new directions. But yeah, I definitely wrote this book with them in mind, because I think as you become a parent, you no longer just think about your own learning, but you're thinking about, well, these new people that you've brought into the world and how can you equip them for success?
I want to talk about as many of the maxims that the subtitle suggests as we can. But before we do that, I thought maybe it would be good to sort of get maybe a 30,000 foot view of the framework. Talk about the see-do feedback framework, if you would.
Yeah. So the inspiration for this book came from a story that I heard online. It was about Tetris players. And it seems like a little bit of an offbeat topic, but it turns out to be kind of the key to understanding everything about learning. So Tetris is a game that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was explosive in popularity. You know, there was op-eds being written about how people were like hallucinating falling blocks when they weren't playing the game because they're playing it so much. But if you compare the performance of players from that era to like 12, 13-year-old kids who play it today, it is not even close to how much better people are today at the game than before. So someone made a comparison. Oh, it's like the 4-minute mile. You know, once you know someone's done it, now there's 4-minute miles. But it's a little bit like if people before they ran a 4-minute mile, like no one had ran a mile in under like 20 minutes, right? And then all of it, now we have people running it under 4 minutes. So like the performance gap is just staggering. And the explanation that was offered, this is John Green did a video on it, and I thought this was fascinating, was that, well, back in the 90s, if you wanted to get better at Tetris and you were playing it all the time because you were obsessed about it, as some people were, all you could really learn from was from your kind of immediate contacts. So maybe, you know, your brother's friend knows a guy and then you could tell you, oh, you can do this, and that's about it. And so what happened is that even though there were people who individually had figured out some of the pieces that you needed to do to break some of these records, these barriers that existed at the time, it was harder to assemble it together. It was harder for people to learn the correct strategy. So what you had is you had people who, even though they were playing it obsessively, were using techniques that we now know people who play the game really well just don't do it that way. That's not the right way to do it. You do it this way. And now we have there's live streaming. There's you can have video camera showing the player's hand so you can see like how they're holding the controller. That, it turns out, is really important because, you know, this is like one of these old game system controllers, and people nowadays, they have like a glove on and they're like flicking it because that's how you press the button fast enough. But it's all sorts of things you would never discover on your own. But now you can just learn it from other people. And because you can learn it from other people, you stop the trial and error. You can actually use the best techniques and you can actually make progress. And this turns out to be something that's not just true of Tetris. This is true of many domains in human history, that the ease of learning from other people determines how quickly you can make progress. So, you know, another favorite example of mine is the transition from alchemy to scientific chemistry. Now, a lot of people have the idea that, well, alchemy was just all mysticism and, it's just people kind of making stuff up and they had wrong theories of nature. But Lawrence Principe, whose work I cover in the book, a chemist and historian, talks about how a lot of these people were actually trying to come up with a theory of matter. They were actually trying to do what we would call chemistry. They were even doing some experiments. They were even trying to take measurements. But the problem was that the culture around alchemy at the time was that, well, this knowledge is really important and we need to keep it secret and we need to make sure that only the best people are doing it. We can't let, the way to turn lead into gold fall into just anybody's hands. So they would do these elaborate things like create these crazy pictures that were these allegories with chimeras and, pictures. And that was the recipe. That was, you had to look at this picture and kind of like the Da Vinci Code, decipher it to figure out what was being said here. And the transition to chemistry is you have Robert Boyle showing exactly what experiments he did. And that was what created progress. So this ability to learn from other people, the C part, was really important. And then, of course, practice is important. Feedback is important. We'll get into those elements as well. But I think this idea of the ability to learn from other people being a key constraint in making progress, I think was something that I hadn't talked about much in ultra learning, but is clearly very important.
And I think this is what you get at when you talk about access to knowledge, because on the one hand, most of us have access to 98% of the world's information in our pocket, but you say it's not evenly distributed. Hence the alchemists, right? Who are kind of holding everything close to the vest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just heard this. I was listening to a podcast that was talking about artificial intelligence research, and they were saying how a lot of these people who were in the field, when they were getting into the field, they were reading papers because everything was being published. But then after ChatGPT came out, all these labs suddenly tightened up. And so if you're not in the lab, you're not reading the research. So they're saying, I don't read papers anymore because none of the good stuff's being published because it's all inside these closed domains. So I think most of life is like the early Tetris players. Most of life is like the alchemist. It is a domain where how people perform the skills, what the best practices are, what knowledge you need to do to succeed is at least somewhat opaque. It's not obvious. And so, in some ways, our model of open science, the Wikipedia, this kind of stuff, this is the stuff that is, accessible, but there's this real, that's the tip of the iceberg of all the knowledge that people have that either they keep close to their chest because it's, for competitive reasons. I'm sure we can all think about in business context where, someone figures something out and they just don't want that strategy getting used too widely because it might disrupt their competitive advantage. But even just for more banal reasons, just the fact that, once someone learns how something works, maybe the knowledge that they have is so obvious that they don't explain it to other people, which can be another factor. Because, I remember talking to people, if you're in an industry and you're kind of outside it, you're sort of, okay, so how do you do this? And they're like, well, you do this and this. And, well, why do you do that? And it's for them, it's obvious that you do things a certain way. But if you're coming from the outside, that can be a formidable barrier to learning how it works.
With regard to the C aspect of this framework, how does, and you hinted at this, how does what we learn from others impact the complexity of the problems that we're able to solve?
One of the ideas that I think was also an inspiration for this book was Herbert Simon and Alan Newell's theory of problem solving. So they view problem solving as a search through a space. So you can imagine it's like trying to find your way through a maze. And the issue that comes up when you see it this way, and then so you have your starting point, you have your end point, you're moving through the maze. The walls of the maze constrain how you can move. And so that's what we're doing when we're solving problems, is we're trying to find moves we can make that get us from our start point to our end point. And one of the sort of key consequences of this is that most problem domains, the space of possibilities is vast. So if you just try sort of a kind of brainless strategy of just trying things out, you're never going to be able to do it. Like my favorite example is the Rubik's Cube. If you are using the correct strategy, you can solve any Rubik's Cube in under 20 moves. I think mathematicians proved that a little while ago. 20 moves is the most you need to do to solve a Rubik's Cube. But if you were to go through every combination, every sort of way you can organize the cube, there's something like 70 quintillion possible combinations. So you would never be able to do it even in the age of the universe, try all of them out. So clearly, to solve the Rubik's Cube puzzle, we actually have to use something other than just trying things out at random. And so I think that's one of the things that helps, because when you're learning from other people, I can learn these are the patterns that are involved in solving a Rubik's Cube to get it closer to that 20 and rather than that 72 million. And so that's 72 quintillion rather. And so that is a major factor in dealing with the complexity, is that if you have access to the best methods, you greatly reduce the size of the problem space, you greatly increase the tractability of the problems. And so even if you do have to do a little trial and error, there. You're building on top of, like, you're getting pretty close to where the solution lies rather than searching, this impossible space. Maybe you only have to try a dozen things or 24 things. And so that's a big key way that innovation happens in many fields, is that you're using all the best methods, everything is already known, you're learning from other people, and then the problem solving you're doing is just that last little layer on top, the sort of seeing on top of the shoulders of giants, so to speak.
Related to that, one of the things I noticed with a lot of my students that have gone through the note-making mastery course is we would go through the process of collecting information, organizing that information, connecting new ideas to existing ideas, then distilling it down, crystallizing it, so that we could then create with what we gathered. And I found that many students struggled with the creation process. They kept saying things like, well, it's not original enough yet, or I borrowed from this and I borrowed from that. Yeah. And what does that then make it? Talk about the idea that imitation is indeed the seed to original work. Your work doesn't exist without it, really.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. We could kind of go into a whole view of like the entire track of like Western culture, but there's been this sort of turn where the traditional culture, like if you go back sort of pre-Enlightenment era, the traditional view of learning was very much you copy from the master. And you can see this still preserved in a lot of other cultures that have sort of maybe don't have that same heritage of like going through the Enlightenment and the Romantics and stuff. But my example I use in the book is painting, that, up until after the Renaissance, it was very much seen as like an apprenticeship kind of craft. Like you would apprentice to a master and you would just copy what they're doing. And through enough copying, you would learn the skills of like, this is how you paint leaves, this is how you paint faces, this is how you paint trees. And that would form the building blocks for how you can do your own work. And even up to the height of virtuosity of like the academy system, where you can think of like just fantastically realistic painters, this was sort of how it was taught, is that you would build these fundamental skills in these simpler settings, and then those would be the building blocks for further painting. And it's only been in sort of, a more recent turn, like maybe the last like 100 years, that there was a real shift on the emphasis of what are we trying to do in, let's say, artistic education. The focus was not so much on, okay, master the craft so you can express a creative vision. It was like, well, you should just have the ability to just be creative from the get-go. And I think this is the wrong way to think about it. I think all of our ideas are in some sense derived from other people. And the way to be creative is not to, it's kind of the opposite. The way to be creative is not to eschew other ideas and like avoid anything anybody else is doing, but rather to have so many other people's ideas that the sort of generalizations and composites of them end up becoming original work. They end up becoming something that was not seen before. So the people who are making the greatest innovations, the people who have the greatest leaps of creativity, it's not that they have not assembled that knowledge. It's not that they haven't brought that together, but that they brought so much together that they're able to see like a new pattern out of it that other people haven't seen before. So I think really, creativity does begin with copying, as I say in the book.
It's often disparate or seemingly disparate ideas or disciplines or industries and a way of doing things or what have you, and you see a connection and a way to combine them that maybe is unique and original, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of crossover and cross-pollination. If you have two skills that don't tend to go together, like they overlap, but they're not, they're not something that tends to go together, you can often have a very unique kind of specialty. There's sort of the combinatorics of it, that like if you're really good at two things that don't tend to be taught together, then the connections that you see, that they're much more likely to be original. So I do think there is a reason for breadth there and for learning lots of different subjects.
You referenced this earlier. I'd love to expound on it. You say that knowledge becomes invisible with experience. What are some of the tools that we can use, Scott, to extract the knowledge that experts often, as you said, take for granted?
Well, I thought this was very interesting because there's this sort of well-known problem, the curse of knowledge, which is that once you know something, it's very hard to put yourself back in that beginner mindset. So even if you're trying to teach something, you're actually, as your stated goal, trying to impart knowledge, it's very common for the teacher to just like rush over a thing. It's like, okay, and then step one, and then step two, step three. And what happened between step one and step two? I don't understand that. And it's because there's various processes that go on in our brain when we learn that tend to make knowledge invisible. So certain skills get proceduralized. So the best way of thinking about that is like motor skills. So try to explain to someone how to like tie their shoes. or to swim. If you've learned it well and you haven't like learned it recently, it's very difficult to like explain how you should move things, even though you can do it flawlessly. And another thing is just that we tend to compress information ahead. So I talk about chunking in the book a little bit, where you see patterns that normal people would see as sort of a bunch of independent points. You see as a constellation. You see the actual pattern there. And so these things can be hard to communicate to someone who doesn't have it. Like, how do you break that down so that you can't see the pattern? How do I explain it to you? And so what I find interesting is that there's this whole subdomain called cognitive task analysis, where psychologists who are sort of faced with this problem of like trying to describe, what do experts do? What do people who know things? What is the knowledge they're using? What are the procedures? What are the skills? How do they make these difficult decisions? How are they making these decisions? There's this whole domain that's kind of cropped up for doing this kind of analysis. Now, to be a cognitive task analyst, to like the practitioner is quite involved, but I do think there are some tips we can take from this discipline in applying to our own work. So one of the ideas is that we want to get people to tell stories and not just give advice. A very common thing is that when you're asking someone for advice, they're going to reflect on, whatever their sort of peccadillos are, like, kids these days are doing this, or I think we should do this, or whatever they feel strongly is sort of their position in the kind of discursive space. You should do this or you should do that. And what's often skipped over are the things that seem so obvious that they're not even worth mentioning. But often the things that are really obvious are the things that are missing. And those things, because they're obvious, are often more important to learn than the like contentious points that you might be arguing. So one of the things that I recommend is, if you have to learn a skill, or even if you just have to get advice from someone, is to get them to focus on what they actually did when they were in a similar situation, and get them to walk through it sort of point by point, like a timeline, like you're a journalist kind of trying to retell it for a story. Okay, so you did this, back in 97, and then what happened after that, and why did you do that this way? And this tends to elicit a lot of this tacit knowledge, or a lot of this obvious knowledge about, how does an industry work? How does a skill work? This kind of thing. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is just simply watching people solve problems, because if you can watch them solve a problem and ask them why they're taking steps that they're doing, they're better able to access that knowledge. When they maybe describe it as a whole, they'll skip over parts because it's not there in front of them for them to think about. So these are strategies that are useful for accessing that knowledge that's become invisible.
When our progress depends on sort of finding a balance between making practice too hard and too easy, how do we get there? How do we ultimately find that sweet spot?
The kind of idea of learning is that a lot of it is about calibrating the difficulty. So there's a lot of research showing that like the same intervention can be either beneficial or harmful depending on where you are with learning. So if you're at the very beginning part, it helps to get more explanations. It helps to watch other people, to see their demonstrations, so that when you attempt to do the skill yourself, you're kind of like in the same ballpark of doing the skill the same way. These are all very helpful. But kind of perversely, if you already have seen those, if you already know kind of at some level in your brain how the solution works, then your memory, your skills strengthen more if you practice remembering it rather than watching it again. So there's all these little like reversals where something works well in one situation and not another. And I think there's a few ways that we can moderate the difficulty, but one of them is to engage in a practice loop. So you see examples, you do a practice attempt yourself, and you get some feedback on that attempt. And pretty much all of the world's kind of most successful pedagogical strategies involve something like this loop. Now, they may change the exact characteristics and how they offer it, but this was the basis of apprenticeship. This is the basis of models like direct instruction, which is a very successful school-based learning technique. You see this in writers' workshops where, people who become very successful novelists, they often attend these workshops where you go to a class, you produce some short story, you get it critiqued in front of the class, and you get to hear other people's stories. And that quickly allows you to cycle through and hone in on the right difficulty. And so these kind of practices can be beneficial because, if you're failing all your attempts, you know that you need to like take some steps to make it easier, work on the building blocks, sort of simplify the problem. And if you're getting the questions right, then you need to push yourself, challenge yourself if you're going to eventually attain higher levels of mastery. But getting those components in a loop is very helpful for really learning them.
It reminds me of some of the research you discuss in the book that I was fascinated by, that talks about how as students we're often drawn to a style or method of learning that isn't the most beneficial to us. Sort of, the learning requires effort, requires energy, and our brain is constantly trying to help us conserve both, right?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting study. It was looking at a bunch of different. It was a paper was looking at a bunch of different effects, and there's this term from literature called aptitude treatment interaction, and it basically
Mhm.
means just what I talked about there. That like the same technique can work well or be harmful depending on your prior ability or aptitude.
Mm.
And so one of the things that sort of kind of perverse from these studies is that they find that when students have to express a preference about what their learning method is, or they make a choice, or they say what they think is going to work better, they frequently pick the thing that works worse. So, like one classic example of this is that lower ability students, and this could be lower ability either because of talent or more commonly just because of background knowledge, they just don't have as much experience in a
Mm.
subject. Lower ability students tend to prefer less structured environments to practice in. And higher ability students tend to prefer more structured environments, but what actually works well for them is the opposite. And so
Mm.
the explanation given by Richard Clark, who's the author of the paper, is that, well, what seems to be happening is that the lower ability students like the kind of the cover that a more flexible assignment gives,
Mm.
because it means they can like not really do what they're supposed to be doing, but because there's less constraints, they can sort of like sort of I'm working on this, but whatever, it's not the right thing, but it's good enough. Like
Yeah.
having the structure and following the structure is hard for them. It's
Mm.
harder for them to do it the proper way. It's easier for them to just like play around. Whereas the higher ability students, the structure is like a memory aid. It reminds them of things that they already kind of know. And so they would get better benefits if they practiced in a less structured environment where they actually have to like think about it and problem solve and work a little bit harder to apply the knowledge. So this sort of shows that like our kind of inclinations about what we should do when we're learning can have this sort of paradoxical self-defeating effect that the thing that we think we're doing that's making it better for us to learn may actually be making it worse. Another one that I talk about in ultra learning, which I think is also related to this effect,
Mm.
is that students frequently rate repeatedly reading the same document, like their notes, a text, as being the most effective studying strategy, but it's not. It's actually
Mm.
better to read it once, close the book, and then on a blank piece of paper, try to write out everything that you can recall. So
Mm.
free recall tends to do better, but students prefer and think they learn better by just reading it over and over again. And this is because as you repeatedly read something, it gets easier and easier, it becomes more fluent, and we mistake that fluency of processing the information for actual learning. And so I think there's lots of little deviations between what works and what doesn't. That it's why I am interested in this as a subject.
In note making mastery, one of the things I encourage students to do when, say, reading a book, the tendency is to, as you take notes, want to write verbatim what the author
Yeah.
said. And I encourage students to instead read it, close the book, and then without referring to the book, write what you learned, what you read in your own words. And that's going to serve you much better and future you 6 months down the road than anything you write verbatim, I think.
Well, that tends to be actually like the reason why, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's been a lot of stuff about how handwritten notes are better for learning than typewritten notes. But the sort of core reason seems to be that actually handwriting is kind of slow. And because it's slow, you actually can't write it verbatim. And you actually have to think about it and think about like, well, how can I compress this in some way so that it will make sense later? Whereas when you're typing, if you're a decent typist, you can just type almost as fast as someone's speaking. So you don't actually have to think about the material. And so that makes a big difference for learning. I know there's some other arguments for it as well, but I think, what you said is absolutely right. Like the brain kind of like, oh, I don't actually have to pay attention to this. I can just copy word for word. You skip over it. And then of course you don't learn it.
And the handwriting forces compression. I love the way you articulated that. Seth Godin once said to me that in order to have a good idea, you have to be willing to have enough bad ones.
Yeah.
Similarly, talk a bit about what you write about, the idea that quality comes from quantity.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought this research was fascinating. So this is based on Dean Simonton's work. Now, he is a psychologist who studies historical cases. So, the way a biographer works is that they go back and they read everything they can about, let's say, Thomas Edison, and then they draw some conclusions about, life based on Thomas Edison, if you're trying to draw inferences from their work. Whereas what he does is he collects a lot of different people. So a lot of psychologists, a lot of inventors, a lot of painters, and then tries to draw quantitative relationships about their work. And one of the most fascinating insights from his research that I just felt like I had to include in the book was that there seems to be a relatively flat kind of ratio between your best works and the total amount of work that you're producing. So if you look at someone's career trajectory, for instance, it forms a very characteristic shape that it kind of, your productivity goes up. It peaks at some point, and then it slowly trails off. And I mean, there's variations here, but this is certainly the average. And one of the interesting findings of this is that this shape of the curve is not age dependent. So it's not like, well, your brain is just becoming really, really good at this age, and then you're just not as smart when you get older. Because it turns out if you start later, you show the same curve. It's just shifted. So it's not, it's definitely related to the career and not just sort of the biological processes in your brain. But one of the things he finds is that when you have this curve, you can also map out all of the works that someone produced. So like a playwright, like all of their plays, so all of Shakespeare's plays or whatever. And then you can also put little dots for what were the ones that had a particularly high impact. So if it's something quantitative, like a psychologist, you could say, well, which papers were really highly cited? Or if it's, someone like Shakespeare, it's like, well, you got Romeo and Juliet and you got Hamlet. Those are like the really big ones. And then there's other ones that, maybe even I haven't heard of. And what he finds is that if you look at this sort of ratio over time, over this sort of creator's lifetime, it's not as if it changes shape. So it's not as if people just steadily get better with experience. So your hit ratio just increases over time as you get more and more high quality work. It's not as if it does the opposite, which is another kind of common hypothesis that, you have this creative spark when you're young, and then as you get old, you just become kind of like playing your greatest hits over and over again. That isn't also what happens. It seems like it's the case that even if you were sort of late in your career, if you have another paper, it has just as much probability of being your most highly cited paper later in your career as earlier in your career. And so he takes this evidence and a number of other sources as evidence for his position that like creativity at the frontier. So meaning that you have mastered the skills to get to the sort of cutting edge of your work. Because of course he's looking at eminent individuals. He's not looking at, regular people. I mean, regular people don't write any plays or invent any inventions. But once you're at the level where you are producing sort of work that's in contention to be remembered and have a legacy, then there is a certain amount of randomness that's inherent in the process. There's a certain amount of, you'll try an idea and sometimes it'll really work and sometimes it really won't. And so this suggests that the people who have the most creative success in their lifetime tend to be fairly prolific. They tend to be people who took a lot of chances. If you want to win the lottery, you got to buy a lot of lottery tickets. So I think, creative success maybe not that rare, but it has the same sort of property that you want to cultivate lots of opportunities to succeed, because you can't always control all the factors that go into it.
You challenge a lot of common ideas, or maybe common expressions is the word in the book. Things like, the mind is a muscle, or like a muscle, and practice makes perfect. You say practice doesn't make perfect, at least not without the right kind of feedback. So my question to you is, why doesn't my decades behind the mic automatically mean I'm good at this whole interviewing thing?
Well, so I think my mental model that I've kind of gleaned from reading a lot of stuff is that the main thing we can say that practice does is that practice makes performance smoother and more automatic. It makes it less effortful. And that can be a very important part of proficiency. Like, think about speaking a language. I mean, we call it fluency in speaking a language because the ability to speak without hesitation and pauses is sort of one of the prime qualities we have of measuring how well someone speaks. Certainly with something like reading a book, for instance, if I have to like decode each letter, that's a C, that's an O, this kind of thing, I'm never going to be able to understand the story. So this is why we need a lot of practice, and certainly why skills that are very fluency, proficiency dependent, you need to have enormous amounts of practice before you can get to a level where you're doing anything interesting or creative with them. But one of the things, and there's some side effects of this, is that, well, first of all, if you practice the wrong skill. So if you perform a skill in the wrong way, there's a certain amount of flexibility. So I don't want to say we're entirely rigid machines copying what we do, but if you learn kind of the wrong technique for doing something, it can make it much harder to learn the right technique later. My classic sort of go-to explanation for this is, well, think about typing on a computer. Chances are you're using one of two different methods. Either you started typing without the instruction from a coach and you started using two fingers, and now you continue to use two fingers, maybe throwing a third in there just for fun every once in a while. Or you took a typing class at some point and you have your fingers on the home row and you move all, 8 fingers plus the thumbs for the space bars to actually type the document. And the thing is that the touch typing method, the one I just described, that is like demonstrably a more efficient method than hunting and pecking. But if you practice hunting and pecking for decades, it's not like it eventually turns into touch typing. You just become faster, more automatic. You do it with less effort. So you will get better, but it's going to plateau at a much lower level than the touch typing. So this is one reason why we want to see the best practices and do this kind of approach. Because if we spend a lot of time practicing a method that turns out to just be less optimal than a completely different approach, then it's going to be very hard to pivot later once that method is highly ingrained. So that's one way that our practice doesn't make us perfect. But the other way that it can be misleading too is that because we become really fluent, because it becomes very automatic, this leads to confidence when we're doing it. But the confidence doesn't necessarily have to mean that we're very competent at what we're doing. So we already talked about how there's this cognitive illusion with studying, for instance, where people read and reread the same text, makes them very confident that they know the text, but they actually do worse on the test than if they just read it once and then practiced, because you kind of have a misleading sense. So, well, it was really easy reading this, so I must really know it. And similarly, for a lot of workplace skills, you have these judgment decisions like whether to hire someone, whether to invest in a project, whether to give someone the green light, your forecast for things. These sorts of judgment decisions, if you do them a lot, you become very confident. You become a more decisive leader, as it were. It's like, I know the right answer because of my decades of experience. But there's some interesting work by the psychologist Paul Meehl that shows that these kinds of judgments, where it's sort of a noisy environment, sometimes you're going to guess right, sometimes you're going to guess wrong. There's a little bit of randomness to it. And whether you guess right or wrong depends on a lot of factors. So if you're hiring someone, there's many, many different things that go into whether or not someone's going to be that are predictive for someone being a good candidate, like where did they go to school, how much work experience they have, other projects they worked on, et cetera, et cetera. And what he finds is that in these kinds of situations, experts become increasingly confident as they get experience, but they don't necessarily become increasingly good. And this can be a major problem with getting tons and tons of practice in these domains, is that you can really sort of deceive yourself in thinking, oh, I have this excellent intuitive judgment, but something as simple as like a tally of pros and cons can beat you on statistical tests.
It reminds me, I think, to my radio career. I spent 26 years there before doing this. And I can divide my career into two halves. The first 13 years was little to no feedback. And my career was just this one long 13-year plateau.
Yeah.
And then in the second half, the second 13 years, I started getting consistent, excellent, challenging feedback. And my career that last 13 years was like a hockey stick as far as like promotions and income and those sorts of things.
So what did you do? How did you get that feedback? I'm very curious.
Yeah, well, I started working for a new company halfway through that invested in their on-air talent with talent coaches.
Yeah, I suspect that like a lot of skills that we practice for work are like kind of nowhere near where they could be proficiency wise, simply because we are in these very poor feedback regimes, like the kind that Meehl studied, where we're just not getting the kind of feedback that in other domains we know are necessary for elite performance. So there's this researcher, Carl Anders Ericsson, he passed away recently, but he had this theory of deliberate practice, which is this idea that coaching plus practice that was strenuous plus immediate feedback, like this was the recipe for eminence in many different fields. And I've been on some podcasts since where people kind of critique this idea. They're like, well, that only applies to like chess or athletics or some kind of well-defined domain of sports or something like this. And that like, that there's some other kind of nebulous expertise that like is real world expertise. And I kind of think it's the opposite. I think that what he identified is that, well, in those domains, it's a little easier to provide those conditions and we have good ways of tracking and measuring it. So everyone does it. But in our day-to-day life, we're just often not getting that kind of feedback at all. And so the sort of actual performance we achieve is very haphazard. So there are some people who either through their own machinations, they manage to get better feedback, or they just have an intuition for it. They're better able to learn. But then there's lots of people that just plateau for years and years at a domain. So I tend to think that if we treated our office jobs, if we treated our workplace jobs more like the chess player preparing for the World Series tournament, or more like the Olympic sprinter who's getting guidance from their coach, we would see just an explosion in proficiency in many domains that right now are just, I think, like way below the threshold of where they could be.
In the area of public speaking, I
Mhm.
used to have this crippling fear. I still have a healthy butterflies in the stomach kind of sensation
Yeah.
when I do public speaking, but I used to have this just debilitating fear of getting up in front of a room full of
Mhm.
people. Talk a bit about the role of courage. Why
Yeah.
is courage so essential? What role does it play in mastery?
Yeah. So, I mean, fears, emotions, these are the things that I think really loom
Mm,
large when we are embarking on a new learning project. Like it's very rarely like I talk to students and they're telling me, you know what, Scott, I've been trying to study this thing, but like I want to know what is the optimal like spacing strategy for these flashcards. Like, no, people tell me, you know what,
mm,
I'm afraid of this, or like I want to start learning this, but it's been 20 years since I've had to like go back to school and I'm afraid. Or I want to do this thing but it's difficult for me. I'm not sure I can do it. And so these emotions and the ability to sort of understand those emotions and regulate those emotions, I think matter a lot more than a lot of like intellectual skills. I think we're used to thinking of learning as this domain of intellect. But I think that's in some
mm.
ways a contrivance because we're used to school environments which sort of like remove all of the things except for this little tiny like IQ test competition. In real life, the emotions, it's not the smartest person who becomes the greatest public speaker. It's someone who
Mm,
does have the courage to come up there and be willing to fail on stage. And so I find very encouraging. There's this whole body of research on exposure therapy and the sort of neuroscience of anxiety. And there's a few key findings from that. So one of them is that the very natural response to dealing with something that is a fearful situation or something that makes you anxious is to avoid it. This is
mm,
hardwired. Obviously,
mm,
I'm afraid of being hit by a car, so I don't walk out in the middle of the street when there's cars going down there. This is very
mm,
natural, very healthy, but it does have a consequence if the situation that you're dealing with is not actually that dangerous. So if your fear is sort of excessive compared to the actual danger of the situation, then avoiding it means that I can never actually learn that about the situation. So I can never actually learn that standing on stage, actually being booed off stage almost never happens, right? That's not
mm,
very likely. Or even if you do get booed off stage, it's not the end of the world. Like you're not going to just drop dead in that
mm,
instant. So you don't learn that thing. And then also the sort of perversely, this feeling that you get when you avoid something that could be scary. So if you were like, you have a crippling fear of public speaking and there's an opportunity to present at work, but then you find out, you know what, your partner at the project, he said he'll do it instead.
mm,
Not only are you avoiding this experience, this feedback that could tell you whether or not your fear is justified, but
mm,
you also maybe get a little bit of relief. Like, oh, okay, now I don't have to worry about that. And
mm.
that reinforces this same avoidance behavior. So exposure therapy was this therapy developed in the 1950s that basically was the idea is that you come up with some hierarchy of things that you're afraid of. So if you're afraid of public speaking, maybe like the lowest thing is like speaking up at like, an all hands meeting with like five people. And then it goes up to like, going to an open mic comedy thing and just like deliberately bombing on stage. That's like your worst fear. And the idea was that if you can experience the fear, go that situation, do the thing that is afraid, have that courage to go up there and you experience it, then over time the fear will diminish because most of the time
Mm.
when we have fears to things, they are kind of out of proportion to the danger. And this is true even for things that do actually have real danger associated with them. So even people who are like afraid of heights, I know there were stories about all the construction workers on the Empire State Building that,
Mm.
you see them walking on those girders and like eating their pale lunches, hundreds of feet in the air. And you're just like, how could they just like calmly eat a sandwich out of their bucket when they're up there? But it's because after you stand on those girders for long enough, it just becomes normal to you. And so
Mm.
this was one of those things that if you can give yourself exposure and if you understand this principle and you can have the courage to follow through on it, you can see your fear response decline so that like yourself, you can have something that was maybe paralyzing to you, just go to something
Mm.
that is like mildly energizing.
It reminds me of what a Disney Imagineer once said in a documentary I watched, and I love this phrase: "Fear minus death equals fun." And I think that kind of encapsulates what we're talking about
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And I mean, I think there's a fine line in our emotions between these intense experiences. So like you said, like fear and excitement are actually quite similar emotions, right?
Yeah.
There's this whole theory of emotions that like we think that there's all these like complicated, distinct types of emotions, but maybe it's mostly just like how intense does it feel and whether it's good and bad. And whether it's good and bad is very context dependent on like what we think the situation is, you know. If someone comes up to you and like gives you a shoulder massage and you look back and it's, you know, your loving spouse, or it's like, you know, some bearded guy with tattoos, you're going to have a very different reaction to that. And so I think this idea that like what we don't appreciate is how much of our emotions are context dependent, and we can change that context.
What haven't I asked you about the book, Scott, that you want to make sure people know or walk away with?
I think a broader point that I always like to try to put across is that anyone can learn anything. And I think this is something that, you know, maybe some of us feel kind of deep down, but in practice, we encounter these limitations. So, you know, they'll agree and nod their head when I say this, but then they're like, oh, yeah, but I could never learn a language, or I could never learn calculus, or I could never learn this other thing. And I think the reason that I have this attitude is not just because I'm sort of a Pollyanna with the rose-colored glasses, but because I really do believe that all of the research about learning shows that really, if you can break down a skill into its parts, if you can figure out what are the component pieces of knowledge you need to have, the procedures that you need to practice, the sort of adjustments, the corrections you need to have, and if you have these correct ingredients when you're learning, then it's really just a matter of putting in the time and putting in the work. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to reach the same heights of proficiency. I'm certainly never going to be a Tiger Woods on the links, but it is the case that I could learn to golf and I can improve at golfing. So anyone can learn anything and anyone can get better at anything, even if there are certain levels of talent and proficiency that, you know, maybe are going to require an enormous amount of investment.
Encouraging, for sure. This is probably a difficult question for most authors to answer, particularly those like yourself who incorporate a lot of research. What are the books you've read that have had the biggest impact on you, would you say?
Yeah, you're right. It is a hard question because I feel like I read so many that you feel like you're being unfair to the books that you don't pick. But I'll suggest a few that I think have had an impact on me that I would recommend to other people. So I really recommend the book Getting Things Done by David Allen. That one had a real impact on me on thinking about productivity. I really like the book Deep Work by Cal Newport. That one has changed how I think about things. For learning, I really like... I really like this book, Fear and Courage by Stanley Rockman. This is a little bit more of an academic book, but it was sort of the jumping off point for the chapter on exposure that I talk about in my book. So there's just a few of the ones that I go to, but I'm sure I could make a list. I have lists on my website where I have like 10 books about a particular topic that I like. You still feel like you're missing some.
I would love to know, with regard to managing your personal knowledge, how you find it best for you to go about capturing ideas and things you want to remember, how you organize those things, distill them down, ultimately create with and from them.
Yeah, so I've kind of like tried out different systems. Now, this book in particular, when I was going into it, I knew I was going to be doing a lot of research. And because I knew I was going to be doing a lot of research, I knew, okay, well, this is quickly going to get to a point where I'm like wasting non-trivial amount of time being like, oh, where did I see that thing? Or I'm going to miss a connection between things that I didn't see. So the basic setup I had was just, I wanted to be organized. So every paper that I read, I had as a PDF. And I just put it in the folder with like the name and the date, and I put notes on it. And then that way it was searchable. So if I was looking for a particular term, I could search it, and it was a little bit more accessible. With the previous book, I had actually printed them all off and I had these like stacks of binders, which just became a nightmare when I had to actually find things later. And when I read books, what I would do is while I read through the book, I would underline any kind of passages that I want to maybe save for later. And I would put a star next to any research that I wanted to, like a citation that I wanted to follow up. So if like someone cites some study and I'm like, oh, that might be interesting. And then I would put a star there. And then when I was finished the book, I would make a Word document where I would like selectively take some of the passages that I'd underlined and type them up again in this thing so I could refine them, and then also include any of the links to the research. And then I would go out and buy those books or download those papers if that was more stuff I was doing. And then one other thing that I did is I used sort of, I kind of gathered a critical mass of research at one point, but I still wasn't sure exactly what the structure of the book was going to be. So I went through a process where I used a tool called the Archive, which is a kind of a Zettelkasten sort of system where you just make these little text files. And I just sort of went through all of my notes on all of the research and sort of refactored it. So it was sort of like, well, here's all the research I've read on expert novice differences, or here's all the research I've read on problem solving or anxiety or whatever it is. And that actually became very helpful when I was writing the chapters because, when I was going to talk about a particular topic, I already had like all the research organized that was on that topic. So it was very easy to like go back and reference it. But I mean, this was more for a particular project where I was just involved, like, reading a huge amount. My sort of natural strategy is a little bit more low key than this.
Do you care to share any details about that?
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, when I'm doing research for reading, I mean, I am a big believer. I do think having proper notes, especially for something of that scope, is very important. But I'm also a believer that the human mind is the best associative memory machine that we have. There's nothing else that competes with it. And so the best way to remember things is to read more things. And so I feel like in some ways, the way you have, like when people say to me, I read these books and then I can't remember them later. And well, first of all, I have to say, well, that's just that's part of the game. Like forgetting things that you read is just how the mind works. But also you're able to retain much more when you know more in that topic space. So as you read more books in a particular topic space, you're able to form this kind of web of connections of different ideas so that when you encounter an idea, it has a kind of like it has hooks that it can sink into. And so, as I'm reading, like if I read a new paper on this kind of thing, even if I don't know all the citations, I'm already thinking of all the other things it connects to. So when I encounter it again, I'm kind of like, it's a lot easier for me to, mention research or talk about things because I've made that web. And so that's an investment that I don't think is so much a note-taking system, but just this habit of lifelong learning and reading a lot. Because I think it does compound. The more you read, the more you're able to retain. And so it kind of strengthens its advantage over time.
Well, if you're hearing this and you're thinking to yourself, gee, I wish this didn't have to end, it can continue. Next month in July, Scott's going to be joining us for a private session for members of the Read to Lead community online. We encourage you to join if you haven't already. We will be discussing in more detail his book, Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. Scott, this has been a lot of fun. I so appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
As I said at the beginning of the show, you're invited July 18th to join Scott and me and other members of the Read to Lead Plus community for an even deeper dive into the content of his book and his thoughts on this topic. If you're not already a member, remember to go to jeffbrown.me. There you can enjoy a free 7-day trial. There's already over a year's worth of content there, and you get to join us for that July 18th meeting with Scott. Again, the place to go is jeffbrown.me. Next week on the show, we're scheduled to welcome Dr. Frederick G. Fert. He's written a book called What's Next is Now, How to Live Future Ready. Again, that's next time on the Read to Lead podcast. That's going to do it for this time. Hope to see you next time. Until then, as always, remember, leaders read and readers lead.